To break it down into 4,000-year chunks. Think of it like this. Gobekli Tepe, 10,000 BC. The first villagers at Knossos, 6,000 BC. The first palace at Knossos, 2,000 BC. To us. Each of those are 4,000-year chunks.
Whoa.
Of time. Yeah. That's 12,000 years for you right there.
That's a crazy way to...
When archaeology is getting started, there's this, this bloke that everybody's heard of called Heinrich Schliemann. And so everybody knows that he found Troy and he proved all the scholars wrong, right? And that's the myth that's there. For some reason, people feel like that at Heinrich Schliemann's time and before him, scholars, they thought that Troy was not a real place and that somehow Schliemann's came along and found it and proved scholars wrong. And I just want to say that's just not true. For example, we know that Alexander the Great went there. We know that Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, went there. We know that in the Byzantine period, in the medieval period, there were a series of Orthodox bishops hosted at Troy. And it was only in the medieval period that Troy actually becomes abandoned. We had coins from it that ended up at other places. You got to read Aelius Aristides. He is this Greco-Roman, and he writes in Greek and speaks in Greek, and he has this kind of autobiography. It's basically him going around, trips out and talks to God. And he's this really wealthy, really important priest, and he gives speeches to crowded audiences from Rome. He knew like wealthy people and the emperor in Rome to all over the Eastern Mediterranean. He went to Egypt and stuff like that. And he takes a lot of drugs. Wormwood is one of the drugs that he takes several times, and it's his favorite. It's kufi and different kinds of substances that have different plants in it. He takes this root hellebore. He starts tripping out, and he's a rich guy, so he's a priest. He has this huge entourage that's always with him. And so he's like, all right, guys, let's go sailing. So they go sailing. He takes some more hellebore, and then the deity tells him, now crash the ship. So he crashes the ship. They shipwreck, and they have to all get back to shore. And so this is his experience.
Today's guest, classical archaeologist from Dartmouth College, Flint Dibble, who you may know from a recent Joe Rogan debate with Graham Hancock on an ancient civilization predating the Stone Age. Flint Dibble's expertise is in ancient Greece, which is my favorite topic of all. So we were going to discuss archaeology of ancient Greece, Gobekli Tepe, Knossos, Crete, and other areas, especially ancient drugs, ancient sacrifice and rituals, Homer, religion, and all of that good stuff. Check out the links in the description and enjoy the show. And welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true Gnosis. And today I'm with Dr. Flint Dibble, who, unless you're living under a rock, you've seen him somewhere by now. Either you watched the Joe Rogan episode that's got millions of views between you and Graham Hancock, or you just saw people talking about it because that's all over the internet as well. And so you're here to talk about ancient Greece. That's my favorite topic. The stuff that's going on in the Bronze Age, the Copper Age, and leading up until the Classical period, all Iron Age, all that stuff. We're going to get into all that stuff. So what you just saw in the intro, that's all coming. However, I just gotta ask you my own personal questions on the recent, I don't know if you want to call it drama, but discussion, I guess, because this is a valuable time for myself as an amateur who I don't have a Ph.D. I just jumped into this stuff. I started interviewing experts in the fields, and this happens a lot where I think I'll get my opinions come in the way, and I'll say, why aren't the experts seeing this? And I get this has happened. I'm just being honest. This happens all the time where I think I'm seeing something, and I'm aware that I could have blind spots because I'm not fully trained. No, but I sit there and I go, and I'm looking at it and I'll go, what? Wow, I think I'm right about this. So I want to ask you, in this day and age, in the internet, where anybody can go online and they can look up translated Oxford translations of primary text, they can go on Topos. They can go on Perseus Tufts. They can get a Greek tutor from Wizant. They can learn Greek within 2 years by themselves without even going to university. What do you think is, my question is, like, what would you say to someone who is pursuing that path, and how should they maneuver the expertise and make use of it?
Yeah, well, that's a tough question to answer. I mean, first of all, yeah, this is a hell of a time for me. I mean, I was walking into work the other day and someone ran up to me and was like, "Are you an archaeologist? I've seen you somewhere." And so it's like really wild and interesting, and it's also interesting to think about this very topic because part of my goal of going on there and chatting with Graham Hancock was to try to defend expertise in a sense. I think that expertise and experience in particular has value, and when you're thinking about the past, it's difficult because, like, us scholars, we've actually been trying to make as much of it accessible as possible for people to delve in and to find what everybody thinks is interesting. And so, of course, though, as soon as you start delving in and you read, I don't know, some inscription on some website or a papyrus or and even translating it yourself from Greek, it does take that kind of experience to understand sort of our own limitations. In a sense, like me, if I'm translating Homeric mythology, I'm very strong. I've taken graduate level courses in that. I know how to do that. I publish, part snippets of translations that relate to my own research on feasting in the Iliad and the Odyssey and stuff like that. And on the other hand, if all of a sudden I start reading like a cuneiform document, and even though I'm a scholar, right, I am not a scholar of cuneiform documents. I'm not an Assyriologist. I'm not, a Near Eastern archaeologist even. And so as soon as I start trying to extract that sort of evidence, I'm going to start making mistakes that people that actually know their shit with cuneiform documents, the same kind of mistakes they made 100 years ago. And it took them 100 years to realize why, for example, that word is translated differently in that context, or why the rest of the documents would show that this document is actually being ironic and it's a joke or something like that, right? And so that's the difference. It's sort of like the scholars have made all these mistakes connecting the wrong dots a million times, connecting dots, say, across the Atlantic Ocean, right? And then they realized the Solutrean hypothesis that was around just what, 30, 40 years ago, this idea that at the end of the Ice Age, there was this lithic technology that's similar, Clovis, in North America, and the Solutrean overshot flakes in Europe. And so they thought maybe people came from Europe to America. And so there were these similarities that made it seem possible. But then with more interrogation, it realized no, they just look kind of similar. There's no genetic evidence. There's no other kind of evidence you could imagine. It's even separated by 5,000 years of time between these lithic technologies. There's no way that we have any sort of evidence that people came from Europe to North America that early. And so it was a mistake in a sense that people made. And well, people still make those mistakes unless you're familiar with the sort of history of scholarship. And that's the kind of experience and reading that I think people who are just interested in diving in, they sometimes forget the importance of learning the history of scholarship. They just want to dive in on what their interest is, the Near East or whatever it is, the end of the Ice Age. But understanding the history of scholarship is what you get training on as a PhD student, for example. You have to take all these really boring classes in the history of archaeological theory, the history of how all these people got these things wrong 50, 100 years ago and why, so that we can understand how to what kind of questions work well with the evidence as we see it now. And some of the questions we're asking now will turn out to be stupid questions in 50 years as well, and that's just life. The evidence is still there. It's just a question of how do we contextualize it? How do we build into it? How do we get new evidence that adds more context?
Yeah, and I think methodology is big because if you don't get that training in methodology, you can just be all over the place. You see this a lot with um well, I'll just Graham, since he's on our minds, he's looking for the evidence to support the claim. See this with mythicism too. I don't know if you know about mythicism. It's a field on the internet that looks for evidence that Jesus didn't exist, stuff like that. Which, whatever. I'm not saying they're all mythicists are bad or whatever, but there are a few who are just like super dogmatic, and they start off with their Jesus didn't exist. All right, now what do I got to do to find out to make this fit and make sure I can argue this? And you can see it's so obvious. This is what they're doing. So I think that this is something people who aren't trained in any sort of historical method get caught up in. They're looking for things to fit what they want to be true.
And that leads, of course, to normal rhetorical flaws like cherry picked evidence, right? You're very selective. But at the same time, you look at something like Hancock, and I mean, again, I really want to emphasize the training we get to look at the history of scholarship, because that's also important too. Because Hancock's ideas are not new; they've been around since the 19th century. I mean, earlier, but there's this really complete version of it that sort of universalizes it in the 19th century with Ignatius Donnelly. And Hancock acknowledges this in his prologue or prequel prologue to Fingerprints of the Gods. He lists Ignatius Donnelly as one of his top influences there. And so, you can see that he's drawing upon this idea that's been around for a while. It's not actually a new idea. And it's funny because, like, that's what scholars usually go with first when they communicate with the public. They often say, look at the historiography of this. This idea has been around forever. It's nothing new. We already know it's not true. We've addressed this for 150 years. And the public, on the other hand, is just like, yeah, but he said this. And it's, why don't you debunk that specific thing? And it's like, okay, so you have to take a different route when you're approaching the public. But yeah, as a PhD student, if I was teaching PhD students on Atlantis, which I do sometimes, that's what I'd start with, is that kind of 19th century, show that history of the scholarship and of the narrative and of the discourse. And showing that history really reveals where everything sort of slots in with it. And so that's the kind of experience that you get in grad school that, like, I encourage amateurs to do this. When people ask me for things to read, I'm like, go read the history of archaeological thought. I doubt many people go read it. It's actually written at an intro undergrad level. It's a very great text. But at the same time, everybody's like, that's not the question I'm interested in. But you're forced to eat that gruel when you're in grad school. So you're forced to get that, even though you don't want it, right?
Yeah, and that's the same for mythicism. It's not it's not a new idea. There in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, it was booming in scholarship, especially in the USSR in the 20th century for some reason. I don't know why.
Huh.
But
well, probably because it makes sense. It's this way of looking at history that ties in well as a secular way of looking at history.
Right,
So,
yeah.
communism.
And if you notice, the online mythicists are all hardcore atheists, all of them.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not all of them. I shouldn't say all of them. I couldn't know that for sure. But Thomas Paine was a famous mythicist. He wrote that Jesus was an allegory of the sun. He thought he thought it made sense at the time. As you point out, and these people are brilliant people, and especially in their time where there's no internet and they have to go to a library and they have to translate stuff by themselves with their hands. And there's like, that's brilliant stuff that they were coming up with. But as time progresses, we learn more data, and things need to change. When you get more data, you have to adjust. You can't just
and when you also learn that certain questions we can't answer, so it's kind of pointless to focus on them, And so one of the things I always try to teach people is the kinds of questions that the data actually matches, because you want to ask questions that the data can answer. Once you start framing your questions so that it's guided towards the evidence you have, you start getting answers that are far more secure. Sometimes they might not be the big questions we're hoping to answer, but just getting that answer in a secure way then opens up new avenues and new ways to approach, new questions you can ask. Yeah.
Last thing I want to ask you about on this particular topic before we get into the juicy fun stuff. So a good friend of mine is Gregory Crane.
Oh, you're friends with Gregory Crane.
Yeah,
I don't know him personally, but of course
I had him on here.
Stuff. Yeah.
Awesome.
Phenomenal.
He famously said to me, he's like, us academics, we have our heads up our asses sometimes, and we write our papers for other academics, and I wish we could be more appealing to the public, because some of our books are really hard to read, blah 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 blah. That's what he said to me. And actually, it's funny because Dennis McDonald also said to me one time, he said, us scholars are like groundhogs, because we're all trained in this one area and we don't leave, but we can go so deep in that one area that no one else can see. And like, that's just how scholarship is. We're all in our own areas. He's like, you and Derek Lambert, you know Derek Lambert.
Yeah.
You and Derek Lambert are like groundhogs. He's like, oh no, he didn't say groundhogs. He said foxes.
Okay.
Foxes can just scatter the land and check the top of everything, and but you guys know a lot of stuff. You guys know all this basic 101 stuff in all these fields, because me and Derek are constantly talking to people like you every day. That's what we do.
Mm-hmm.
So we're learning. We're not getting trained in one area. We're not being experts in anything, but we're learning all this basic stuff, right? And I was like, that's a really good analogy of that. Makes a lot of sense. But it also reminds me how I can't go as deep as some of these trained experts are in their certain fields. It's good to remind myself that. But back to what Crane was saying about, scholars are kind of siloing themselves off in a lot of ways. Not everybody. There are some good scholars who are really trying to reach the public. Like online, especially on YouTube, like, Digital Hammurabi, Guts at Gibbon. They're doing phenomenal shit online, and I'm learning so much shit from watching them. So not everybody, but I get what Gregory Crane was saying. But he mentioned that once in a while, it's actually pretty rare, but it does happen where someone with no PhD comes along and they do the proper. They try their best to stick with what the scholarship is saying. They don't just go off into ancient aliens mode, but they actually really want to learn what's the truth. Where they're reading the up-to-date scholarship. They're going to the primary sources. They're looking at the archaeological data, and then they can act like Robert Strasser was his big example. Robert Strasser didn't have a PhD, but he translated all these books and of Herodotus, Thucydides, Arian was another one, and I think Xenophon. And he did all this work. He wrote all these peer-reviewed papers, and then he got awarded an honorary PhD. And it's like, nice. So it does happen where people can come up and just out of the love of the game and become something that could contribute to that. But that being said, there's a way that it's a hard path, but there's a way that can be done, and it's not what Graham Hancock's doing. Let's be real.
I mean, no, I think that this idea that we gatekeep, obviously most people that do real scholarship have PhDs, but not all. I've worked with plenty of people that have masters or with BAs or even not. In the field, in archaeology, you're working in the field with people of all sorts of different educational attainment. And, you have, you sometimes get retirees, people retire from what they're doing, and then they want to do archaeology for, the next decade or something. And so I've worked with plenty of them. I mean, if they're really wealthy, sometimes they get research assistants, they fund projects, and they end up publishing their own stuff. Like this guy, Malcolm H. Weiner, he funded the Institute for Aegean Prehistory, right? And so he helped fund all these excavations, but he became a scholar in his own right. I first met him when he came and gave a lecture for our PhD program. And so, he's published plentiful peer-reviewed papers. I mean, he has a big advantage. He was rags to riches, a multimillionaire. So, that's the big advantage. But you don't need that either to go and do archaeology and experience it. I think much of it really comes from the level of experience you have. You become familiar with certain things. You start developing some questions. You collaborate with experts. And I think the big difference with someone like Graham Hancock and these other people we're talking about is the respect for expertise. This idea, if you're going into this kind of question and you're sort of thinking, I'm going to prove all the experts wrong. Well, I mean, what the hell? Like, this is not some sort of conspiracy here. Right. I think that, yes, many experts are like groundhogs, but a lot of them actually, we're always willing to share what we have. You can't shut archaeologists up. If you want to get archaeologists, I'm going to start doing this on my YouTube. I'm just going to start having like 100 colleagues on. And so it's just like, we all want to talk. And we're all doing so many different projects, so many different topics all over the world that it's like, if you're ever at a party with an archaeologist, trust me, go talk to that archaeologist. I suppose 2 out of 10 of them are going to be shy, but the other 8, we have stories to tell about. I don't know, like this one time on a dig in the Crimean Peninsula. It's in the middle of the countryside. It's right where the charge of the Light Brigade happened. Right? It's right in that valley in the Crimean Peninsula. And there's this rural brothel down around the corner from where this excavation is. And so one morning, and it's like this Roman fort there, this Roman Hellenistic fort. And so one morning we show up at 6 a.m. and there's a prostitute with her client there. And so it's like, we just have weird stories. They ran off, And so it's just like, I have so many weird stories about surveying the Greek countryside. One time we came across a goat with a bucket on its head. We took the bucket off the head. The goat ran away. We still have no idea why the hell this goat had a bucket on its head. Maybe the herder put it on purpose, and because he was ravaging something or attacking other goats. I don't know. And so maybe we shouldn't have taken that bucket off the goat's head. But, the point is archaeologists, God, we love to talk about what we study and what we're doing. And so it's funny because you look at Twitter or something like that, and it's filled with archaeologists that they don't always know how to share what they have with the public, but they're always willing to, right? If you see what I mean. And so, yeah, it is tough though. And we need to learn how to, you're sort of trained in grad school, how to write and talk in this very dense technical language. And so what I always tell people is lose the technical language, but don't dumb down what you do, because people are interested actually in what we do, the nuts and bolts of it. Obviously not everybody, but somebody who's going to tune into an interview like this will be. And
Yeah.
so but you don't want to dumb things down, but you want to make the language understandable so that whoever's listening in, tuning in, can get the point you're trying to say.
And
Yeah.
I've seen that on Twitter, where I've seen, because I know enough now where I can understand some of that lingo or whatever. And I've seen, I'm not going to name names or talk shit, but like I've seen people like do some show off shit where they'll like ask a question in a certain way where they're using all this puffed up and I'm thinking to myself, you could have just said it like this. And even me, I'm just like, why didn't you just say this, this, and this? And then everyone will understand what you're saying. That was a dumb way to say it. But it was kind of like the person was being a show off. But I'm not going to name names. But I just want to ask, but what do you think people can do to collaborate better with? Because not everybody has a podcast like I do. Is there a way people, like, what about submitting a paper maybe? I don't know.
Submitting papers are tough because you need to demonstrate that you're asking a question that fits. You have to deal with a niche and stuff like that. I'm not saying that it's not possible if you've really delved in far enough. I mean, I've seen. I'm proofreading a paper that Amateur has written on the erosion idea of the Sphinx. So I'm giving him some edits. He's a geologist. He wants to show how there is no erosion evidence and how it's actually wicking up from the ground. And so he's done on-site sort of stuff. He actually sent it to me right before I went on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I've not gotten to it. So this is a good reminder to go look up Bob Schneiker's email and read it for him.
Nice.
And give him some feedback.
Welcome, Bob.
Yeah, I on my YouTube I did an interview with him and Dan Fallu about the geoarchaeology of the Sphinx. And so yeah, I think it is possible, but that's going to be a tough step to cross. I mean, even academics get papers rejected all the time.
Oh yeah,
right? And so it's just that's so you're setting yourself.
Oh, I'm not saying that they should all be accepted. I'm just saying I think there are people who are getting very good in the amateur world. They're doing the full. They're getting their tutors in these languages. They're learning the languages. They're reading the primary sources. They're reading the up-to-date articles. And like, look, some of these people, like Chrissy Hansen, she doesn't have a PhD. She's writing articles, but I should probably ask her what she does. She already knows.
Well, I'd say so. The first step as a student, let's say you're not doing classes, so you want to do this as a student. The first step, I think, would actually be to present a paper at a conference, or even just go to some conferences, start talking to some people, because I think that's the big goal. Pitch your idea in front of people that are experts in that niche, see how they respond. Say, look, I'm thinking of next year submitting an abstract to give a paper on this. That kind of thing, I think, would be because that's what you want before we submit a paper for peer review, for example. I've already presented it probably at 2 to 3 different conferences and different angles of it. I've already talked about it with a number of different colleagues and stuff like that. And that feedback is really important because, like I said, we all don't know what we don't know. And there's always other experts out there that know something more precise about that little sub niche that contributes to your paper. And
that could have helped Graham so much. Graham could be light years ahead of where he's at if he just bounce his ideas off other people more instead of just
accepted the criticism as well, because he does that. He goes and talks to archaeologists. I've talked with plenty of archaeologists that have ended up on film with him, for example, and in general they're like, yeah, we had a really genial conversation for like 2 hours. I explained why what he was saying was wrong, and then they clip out a few sentences that make it look like they're almost agreeing with him. And so it's just like,
that's
just it's a real problem. And so I think his goal is not to get any expert feedback, really.
I actually stopped watching his Netflix show when I saw the part where he made it seem like scholars don't know about Gobekli Tepe.
Yeah, I know.
Do you see that? And I go, what? I'm like, what is he talking about? And he found like one older guy who probably is like got graduated in the 60s or something, probably some like way back in the day. And he found the one guy who didn't know what it was. And was like, look, everyone, here's the face of academia. I'm like, this is some dishonest shit.
I mean, geez, when I was an undergrad, Gobekli Tepe was on the cover of the textbook, that Renfrew and Braun had. Like, this is like 20 years ago. This is not like
I've known about it
before Hancock published on it or anything like that.
It's like wild stuff. Anyways, so let's get into the fun stuff. So speaking of Gobekli Tepe, this is an late Stone Age place. Well, I don't know what you would call it. It's like, so maybe you can explain it a little bit. But when we look at that time period, a lot of people might not know this, but it's not like the only not the only structures that are around. For example, we have Jericho down in where Israel is, and then a little bit, and then a little later, a couple, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 years later, which is a lot of time, but we're still in the Stone Age. So let's get real. It's still old. 7,000-ish BC, according to what I was looking at. Maybe you can correct that if it's wrong. Knossos or Knossos, Knossos, down where Crete is, and where the Minoans were, and there was supposedly right where the famous Minoan palace is. Underneath, there's another layer, and it's a Stone Age layer. So what's going on in this late Stone Age period? What can you describe about these three places?
Yeah, so I mean, I think let's not start with Gobekli Tepe. Let's start again, like I said, with the history of research in a sense, right? And so in that sense, you could almost start with Knossos, where, you know, when people were interested in these areas of the world, let's not even start with Knossos. Sorry. Let's take another step back. Let me debunk a really pervasive myth right here.
Awesome.
So when archaeology, and I got to do a whole YouTube episode on this. When archaeology is getting started, there's this, you know, this bloke that everybody's heard of called Heinrich Schliemann, right? And so everybody knows that he found Troy, and he proved all the scholars wrong, right? And that's the myth that's there. For some reason, people feel like that at Heinrich Schliemann's time and before him, scholars, historians really, because there weren't any archaeologists, they thought that Troy was not a real place, and that somehow Schliemann's came along and found it and proved scholars wrong. And I just want to say that's just not true. Nobody ever thought that Troy was not a real place. For example, we know that Alexander the Great went there. We know that Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, went there. We know that in the Byzantine period, in the medieval period, there were a series of Orthodox bishops that had a bishopric hosted at Troy. And it was only in the medieval period that Troy actually becomes abandoned. We had coins from it that ended up at other places and stuff like that. So this idea that Schliemann found Troy and proved to everybody that it existed, nobody really in their right mind thought it didn't exist. There was a big debate over where in that specific region of Turkey that Troy was located, and he demonstrated it was on that mound at Hisarlik where we now identify Troy as. But there was no doubt that Troy was actually a place, right? And so a little after Schliemann, and Schliemann, by the way, was like a businessman, right? So he was an entrepreneur, rags to riches, got wealthy, decided he wanted to do all this archaeology stuff. He excavated at Troy. Then he excavated at Mycenae, where he found the shaft graves and that, you know, golden mask of Agamemnon. And then along next generation comes this guy, Arthur Evans. So now we're talking early 20th century instead of the late 19th. And he's more of an anthropologist. So he travels around the Balkans and he does all this ethnography into dance and music and understanding ritual and different sort of traditional cultures. And it's through this that he goes to Crete. And he hears from people, just like Schliemann didn't actually find Troy. Should have mentioned that. This guy Dorpfeld excavated there beforehand. Not Dorpfeld. What's his name? I'm blanking on his name, but it was excavated beforehand by another amateur archaeologist, and it was already known by the locals. Ditto with Knossos. So Arthur Evans discovers it due to he finds some of these local linear A or B tablets, probably linear B tablets on the market. That interests him, some antiquities. Again, it had already been sort of traced by a Greek scholar at the time. But then Evans buys the land, and he does major excavations there, and he uncovers that palace. And that gives us this beautiful picture of kind of Bronze Age civilization. And it's at this time that, you know, people start getting more interested in the more everyday implements. Because if you go to Knossos, some of the most striking things, you have the wall paintings. They're amazing. But if you're thinking about artifacts, it's these giant storage pots that are larger than you and me together. You could cram 2 to 3 people in each one, and they're heavily decorated, and they're in these sort of storage magazines just crammed in there. And that, you know, Evans in his book, The Palace of Minos, focuses on these storage vessels for many chapters because they're a huge deal. There's a significant quantity of them. They have sometimes some linear B even on them. And so that really starts putting the Bronze Age on the map in a different way. It's not just this Trojan War stuff. Troy, Mycenae, etc. Now we have the Minoans here, where something different is going on. And as the 20th century progresses, people are focusing all over. And that's when Tel es Sultan, also known as Jericho, was discovered by Kathleen Kenyon. And so now we're moving further back in time chronologically from the Bronze Age to sort of the Stone Age, but it's the end of the Stone Age. So it's the Neolithic period, the new Stone Age is what that means. And Neolithic in particular is known for the Neolithic Revolution, which is the domestication of crops and animals, the development of agriculture. And so Jericho is actually one of the earliest sites that has agriculture. It's not the earliest, but it's one of them. And it also is one of the earliest sites that has monumental architecture. Kathleen Kenyon excavated this monumental tower there. And it's not built out of megalithic stones, but it's as large as anything at Gobekli Tepe, for example, and it dates to the exact same period, the pre-pottery Neolithic. And so it's the exact same period. We've known that there's monumental construction during that phase of humanity in Southwest Asia for, 50, 60, 70 years. So, since then, what we've seen is a major explosion. And I tried to explain a little bit of this on Joe Rogan in archaeological research, where, as people are recognizing that anywhere you go, you find archaeology because humans have been everywhere, right? And so now every time a building is built, infrastructure, highways are put in, archaeology happens. And at the same time, academics are getting much better at how to find archaeology. We start using aerial photographs. We start using, satellite imagery. We start doing surface walking and map out the pottery or the stone tools that are on the surface so that we can target academic excavations in a more secure fashion to find something that's worthwhile. And that's actually sort of how Gobekli Tepe was found. So Gobekli Tepe was found around the same time that Kathleen Kenyon was excavating, like 10 years later in the 1960s. Nobody knows this. Gobekli Tepe was found in the 1960s from a surface survey. Scholars were walking around mapping sites that were visible, and they saw the top bits of Gobekli Tepe, and they actually thought it was like a much later medieval cemetery. And so then later on, fast forward to the 1980s, and now there's a rescue excavation going on in Turkey. I think it was an area that was going to be flooded for like a dam. And they find Neveli Chori, which is the first of these megalithic T-pillar sites that was excavated. Klaus Schmidt was one of the excavators there. He's the one that excavated Gobekli Tepe. So he becomes enamored with this T-pillar thing, and he's scoping out the area, rechecking older sites that were cataloged, and he goes back to Gobekli Tepe, and he realizes all the sherds, all the evidence there, the lithics are not sherds. All the lithics are Neolithic in date. Does not seem to be medieval. It seems to be Neolithic. So he digs there, and he finds that second megalithic T-pillar site, and clearly very, very well preserved, in good shape, and it's earlier than that Neveli Chori. It lines up well with that Jericho, the first evidence at Jericho for that tower in terms of date, pre-pottery Neolithic B. And so when YouTube goes crazy, Gobekli Tepe has overturned everything about archaeology. It's sort of like, all right, wait a second. A, we already knew there's monumental construction this early. B, Klaus Schmidt had already found a T-pillar megalithic site, Neveli Chori, earlier than that. It just was, inundated by this dam or the construction project that was going on. And so it wasn't something tourists could go see. It didn't have beautiful preservation in the same way. And then C, it was archaeologists and archaeological work that found this and documented it and put it on the map. And so it's just like, no, we weren't forced to accept this. We were happy to accept this because this was all the accomplishment of, 50, 60, 70, 100 years of research and the way that we do things and target this stuff meticulously. And so, so that's kind of the history of it. And so but what was astounding, let's go into why Gobekli Tepe is so cool. It's because it's not agriculturalist. So it takes place at the very early bit of the Neolithic Revolution, where we start getting domesticated crops in particular, and some animal species showing up in this sort of very early pre-pottery Neolithic, before there's even any pottery. So it's the exact same time, Jericho, Abu Huraira, other sites have this domestication going on. But at Gobekli Tepe, it's all wild crops and wild animals. And it seems like they're probably only there seasonally during the warm months of the year. So something like half of the year when they show up. So in a sense, what they're doing is they're harvesting wild wheat. And that's one of their key things they're harvesting. And as I explained on the Joe Rogan podcast, in a sense, the difference between wild wheat and domestic wheat is how it falls off, which shows that they might have been harvesting it, but they weren't planting it, because Gobekli Tepe was occupied for several thousand years, more than enough time that if they were harvesting it and planting it, the plant would have adapted to that control in its reproductive life cycle, and it would have changed how those sort of seeds fell off. They would have attached better. And so we know that they're harvesting this wild wheat, and that flourishes. It's ready for harvest in the spring. They probably were in the lowlands. It's just climatically, we're guessing, regionally, we're guessing that they were probably in the lowlands. They probably got the first bit of the wheat harvest in the lowlands, and then they moved up to the uplands, harvested that wheat, they stored it. There's likely evidence they might have even fermented it into beer. And so then during the late summer, sorry, what'd you say?
I just said, wow. The reason why I'm saying that, I'm thinking of, this is the region where Sabazius and Dionysus is sort of big, Demeter, grain goddess. And I know this is way later, but I'm thinking like, religion's always looking back to their ancients, and so like these traditions get passed down, and you can see why these things would be so divine to them. Because
well, this is the foundation of all these societies, even into classical Greece, of their wealth. It's all based on agriculture and animal husbandry. That's the core of wealth. We think of wealth as like these pretty monumental things, and it's like, no, those monumental things were paid for by somebody's, multiple farms and huge herds of animals, in a sense. And so it's tough. We can talk about some of this continuity in religion when we get down more to the Bronze Age and then into the historical period. But we know that they're regionally at Gobekli Tepe regionally because they're also hunting gazelle. And so the gazelle, we know isotopically from their teeth that they're coming through that region during the late summer, fall. And that's how we can tie in when they're there. Yeah.
We'll put a pause on what, because I know you have more to say on this, but I just want to ask a couple of questions on this. Yeah. Is this before the Indo-Europeans come down to Turkey, or are they already there? Is this them?
Well, so this is one of these big things that we have a lot to figure out on. Is how I'd put it. I think
because this is before the Indo-Europeans, right? Isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Indo-European is a term that most scholars don't use too frequently anymore, because it's really better used as a term to describe language groups. So that's actually what it means. It's this Proto-Indo-European language group, and that doesn't always match on exactly with genetics. If you see what I mean.
Yeah, I don't care about the genetics. I'm talking about the people who are talking.
Well, we don't know because we don't have any text from that early. That's the problem. True. So we don't know. We don't know what language they were speaking. Yeah, and so there are people that are working. I should know more about this. Sorry, go on. Yeah, I know who to talk to.
Is it? I just want to know if it's even possible. Could these people have been Indo-European speakers in this time period, or what do you think about that?
I have no idea.
The only reason why I'm fascinated by this question is because then we can say that the Greeks and the Hittites and the Etruscans, the Italians are sort of coming out of this area, this little Black Sea Turkey area. That would be fascinating.
Definitely to a certain degree, yes. And definitely to a certain degree, no. In a sense, so that's how we can get back to Knossos, is we can think about how the foundation of Knossos connects. So you have this area, this Fertile Crescent, which basically goes from Iraq and Mesopotamia all the way up to the Zagros mountain range, which cuts it east-west, and then down along the coast through, Turkey, down through Israel, in a sense. That's the Fertile U-shaped crescent that you think about. Sorry, let me get on camera and do that. So and so that's our Fertile Crescent, and we're talking here something like 10,000 years ago or so, that this is happening, this development of agriculture, and it takes a few thousand years for all these different crops and animals to be domesticated, and for everybody to end up becoming sedentary. The development of pottery technology, Neolithic technology, for example, comes in for harvesting these crops. So this is what we call kind of a Neolithic package. When this sort of group that establishes itself, it's multiple different cultures, but they establish themselves in this sort of Southwest Asia region, and they end up expanding their numbers. They fill up the region. They eventually start traveling out towards other regions. And so that's certainly a migration of people as well as technology. We see sort of the first establishment of people, in Knossos is one of the earliest establishments actually in the Aegean. On Crete, it's obviously a large island. It has everything from coastal plains to upland plateaus to mountains. It's very well connected with other for trade and for movement of people. And so that's one of the places they target. But then they, of course, go across Turkey, what we think of as Turkey, and into the Balkans across, the Straits of Bosporus right there where Troy and Istanbul and whatnot are. And so we also get some very early settlements on another project I've worked on in Albania and Vashtami, which is similar period. And this is an upland region where it's very biodiverse with a lot of lakes. And so that both of these establishments are something like 7th millennium BC. And so what it looks like, these people moving out of sort of what we think of as the Near East, the Southwest Asia area, they're targeting sort of areas that are going to be plentiful, and they're targeting areas that are biodiverse, and they're targeting areas perhaps that might not be as filled up with hunter-gatherers, because there was Mesolithic hunter-gatherers that were living in what we think of as Greece today, or Albania, or the Balkans, or Crete, or whatever. So yeah, we do have people on Crete in the Mesolithic period, but we're unsure if they were there.
What is the timeline for the Mesolithic? What's the time frame?
So the time frame for the Mesolithic is sort of from the end of the Ice Age down to this initial Neolithic. So until these first farmers come.
So like 10,000 to 6,000?
Something like that, 10,000 to 6,500, exactly. And so, in a sense, while in Turkey or southeast Turkey and Israel and Iraq, we get this Neolithic revolution happening. That's not happening in Europe. And so, in every sort of place, there's these different transitional stages. Usually, it's called the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, and so that is after the end of the Ice Age. There's no more Neanderthals, so the Paleolithic is over. The Upper Stone Age has finished. The Upper Paleolithic is finished, and then the Mesolithic is at the end of the Ice Age, up until whenever farming gets there. So farming sort of radiates out from these different places where plants and animals are domesticated, whether it's Mesoamerica, whether it's Southwest Asia, whether it's Eastern China, different places. And so it sort of radiates out, and you get what we call the initial Neolithic. And that dates differently. We can see that progressing, step by step almost, sort of across the Mediterranean and then across Europe and North Africa from Southwest Asia, right? And so, you have a question.
Yeah. So maybe this might be, I'm just going to throw this out there and see if you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if someone is at my level, this will help understand what we're talking about, because this is not a global phenomenon where everyone's progressing at the same rate and the same, like in Europe, there's a different progression of advancements happening with agriculture and whatnot. In Levant, in Crete, in modern day Turkey, Anatolia. So I guess to bring it back to you, we're talking about this period between 10,000 and 6,000. It's 40,000 year period. It's a long time. I mean, it's almost as long as we can say.
It's like you think about it. We're as far removed from the first palace on Knossos,
right?
As they were from Gobekli Tepe at Knossos, the first village at Knossos, right?
Yeah. So what was,
so in a sense, yeah. So you could break it down into 4,000 year chunks. Think of it like this: Gobekli Tepe, 10,000 BC. The first villagers at Knossos, 6,000 BC. The first palace at Knossos, 2,000 BC. To us, each of those are 4,000 year chunks.
Wow.
Of time. Yeah. That's 12,000 years for you right there.
That's a crazy way to look at it. Now, what's going on in, like, I'm just going to pick a random place, Gaul, or I guess that'd be modern day France. What's going on in France in the same time that Knossos is being built?
Yeah. So that's a Mesolithic culture. Yeah. So it's very much Stone Age hunter-gatherers. The climate has ameliorated though, and it's all now anatomically modern Homo sapiens. There's no Neanderthals or anything like that around. And so these Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, so the Mesolithic is sort of associated with microlith traditions. So what that means is stone tools have gotten much smaller. We have this silly way, and I don't understand why on YouTube everybody thinks that bigger means more advanced. When you look at like sort of construction techniques, they generally go from large stones until now we're down at like concrete and modular type stuff, right? You
Good
think
point.
about computers, you have a giant computer, and then now we have it all as a smartphone, right? Or a watch.
Well, think
And
about it like
so,
this. Let me jump in for real quick, because I got
yeah.
such a good point. Why would you want to make giant megalithic? You know how much manpower and how much it's going to cost to do all that? When you can figure out an easier and cheaper way to build, you're going to do that every time.
And it's going to even survive better. On average, you can build in ways to survive earthquakes if you're building with smaller materials, right? You can arrange the stones in different ways. You can put in wood in different ways. If it's just one giant stone, stacked on top of another giant stone, there isn't that much you can do to adapt to your local circumstances, whatever it is, whether it's earthquakes or flooding or whatever. And so, smaller is oftentimes better. And the same thing is true of stone tools. So, in the lower Paleolithic, the very bottom layers, that's why it's called the lower Paleolithic. So the oldest Stone Age, very first stone tools that are made are fucking giant. One of my friends, George Leader, studies these in Southern Africa. And I mean, to flint knap, he's doing experimental flint knapping with this to see how people make stone tools. He's like bashing boulders on each other to see what it does, right? And so, I mean, he was a postdoc with my dad. They built this flint knapping robot. So it sort of comes out of that kind of experimental.
That's why he named you Flint, huh?
Yeah, my brother's name was Chip. Yeah, my dad studied Neanderthal stone tools, and
awesome.
He was an expert in sort of digital archaeology and Neanderthals. And so with stone tools, then the lower Paleolithic stone tools are large, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller over time because people realize, look, it's not about how big the fucking rock is in your hand. It's about maximizing the amount of edge. Because what a stone tool is a knife. It's the edge. So the smaller you make it, you can start hafting it in wood, and you need less stone, right? Because it's all edge. It's just a tiny little sort of sharp blade, and you can start hafting those in stones to make sickles or knives or whatever you want to do with them. And so, stone tool technology, as it progresses by the Mesolithic, it's extremely small. It's much, much smaller. We've now gotten away from these kind of Paleolithic sort of chunky. I should have brought down some of my stone tools. I'm sorry. But sort of some of these Paleolithic chunky looking stone tools to something more refined and smaller that oftentimes will be hafted into wood. And so therefore you're maximizing your raw material. You don't have to carry around as much stone material to make a new stone tool, for example. And so you can go longer distance, therefore, away from where this raw material is, because in the Paleolithic, people are oftentimes clustered around where the stone material is available. That's why in the Jordania River Valley, where my dad excavated for like 20, 30 years, I guess 30, 40 years, that's right near where all these flint outcrops are. Different areas of Turkey have obsidian outcrops. This kind of stuff regulates where people can spend time, because they're reliant upon the right kind of stone that fractures in a predictable way so that you can make these stone tools. And so by the Mesolithic, they're making wrong place. They're making really tiny, even like this tiny, little tiny bladelets, we call them, sort of microliths. And then they're hafting them and sort of embedding them in wood. And so that lets them expand and occupy and hunt and forage in a wider range of niches, if you see what I mean. And so it's sort of, yeah.
So that's kind of how we date periods, is we look at the technology, and that sort of gauges what they're capable of. Microliths give us this new Stone Age, and then you get copper, and now we're in the Chalcolithic because they're using copper, and then bronze, and then it's a Bronze Age. Is that basically the nutshell of how they date the time periods?
Well, that's how it started, yes. And that's why those rough frameworks come around, is from stone to bronze to iron, etc. That what it shows is, in these different places, we see this progression from one to the other, at least among some groups. Stone tool technology never really goes away. Hell, some eye surgeons still use obsidian, because obsidian is so sharp. And so, so it never like goes away. But yeah, you do see this kind of rough progression. It gives you some idea of time frame. We now know that it's a little out of date, because copper starts earlier than the Copper Age, and iron starts earlier than the Iron Age, with exceptions, though, and exceptions that therefore sort of prove the rule,
right?
If you see what I mean.
Yeah, because not everyone has access. It's like to like the real elitist, rich rulers that had this stuff, right?
So that gives you a kind of relative chronology. but it doesn't give you absolute dates. What that took was the radiocarbon revolution, sort of in the 1960s, the same 1950s, really, right in the wake of sort of World War II, as people are understanding atomic stuff and isotopes at a much smaller scale. Willard Libby, he won a Nobel Prize for this. He developed radiocarbon dating, and what he realized was that sort of this one isotope of carbon-14, decays at a known rate, and you can sort of therefore track how fast it decays by understanding the ratio of carbon-14 in organic material.
Isn't it up to 30,000 years, and then it starts to get hard?
Yeah, about 40,000 years, yeah. And so we have a number of other similar radiometric dating now to go back further, but not even to necessarily go back further. We can date different kinds of substances. So radiocarbon, you need organic material. So at first we did it with like wood that people were building, buildings out of. Now we realize that you can have old wood. You can have that same roof beam around for 1,000 years. We know this if you go to old churches in England, for example, right? And so that dates when that tree was cut down or where that part of the tree even was growing. So if you have a really old tree, a tree that lasts 1,000 years, certain segments of its trunk will date to 1,000 years different from other segments of its trunk. So we try to actually use short-lived species now. So seeds, bones, things like that we can date because we can date a much smaller quantity of material because we've improved how we measure it in a sense. And so we want to date short-lived species that probably won't be sitted around. But we can do a whole bunch of other stuff. We can do something similar. It's called optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, or sometimes it's called thermoluminescence. And so what that dates is the last time that something was exposed either to fire or the sunlight. So you can date sediments. So let's say, a roof collapses. That last time that stone or that sediment saw sun was right before that roof collapsed. So you could date that now with this sort of technique. Or we date other types of radioactive isotopes like uranium, thorium. So uranium decays into thorium, and so that's another very useful sort of. So we have a lot of different things we use for dating in that sense. It's not just radiocarbon, but radiocarbon is one of the cheapest, most readily available. If you're within the last 10, 20,000 years, it goes as maximum to 40,000. But the older you get, the less you might detect it because you need collagen that's preserved, the organic material. Yeah.
Now, those T-shaped stones that we see at Gobekli Tepe, you mentioned there's another site that had similar looking T-shapes. What do you think? What is that about? Is it something that's very simple to make? It looks very complicated.
Wait. So you're asking me whether the T-shapes are complicated or not?
Yeah, like how did that come about? Where the first like designs we start to see are something that looks to me, I'm like, I could be wrong, it looks very complicated. How it's etched in and stuff like that. Obviously,
you mean like the sculpting and stuff? Yeah, I mean, so I wouldn't call the actual T shape so complicated. It's just stacking a stone on another stone.
Oh, so the other ones don't have any engravings on them.
No, some of them do. Some of them do. That's what I was saying. I was misunderstanding what you were asking. I thought you were asking about the T shape, the engravings. Yeah, that's certainly complex and totally, phenomenal. I think those carvings on Gobekli Tepe are really fantastic, and we have a lot of comparable engravings on stones. From other pre-pottery Neolithic sites nearby. Choyunu or Karahan Tepe was just discovered and it's been on YouTube and stuff like that and published. And so there are other comparable sites for sure. And I mean, I think it's really a testament to the time and energy that these people took into, elaboratizing this sort of monumental center to this sort of seasonal settlement. I mean, they went to Gobekli Tepe for thousands of years because they knew that this niche was just so effective. There was such a huge amount of food available seasonally from the wild wheat and then from the gazelle coming through and then other plants and animals that they harvested. But those were the two main sort of sources of calories for the people living there.
Sure.
And so, they as I like to put it, they found this niche and they learned how to exploit it. And it was just such a valuable niche. They could stay there all for half a year and just work to turn this settlement into something meaningful for them and build up this ceremonial center. And then now the German team is starting to excavate areas outside of the ceremonial center. So we're getting more kind of workshop areas, residential areas where people are living, working, and storing their food, as opposed to the ceremonial center that was first discovered, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, let me ask you about the ceremony thing. So
yeah,
this location, if you had to guess, I know that we haven't figured this out yet, but you, Flint Dibble, you're just thinking in your head, you had to guess. Someone has a gun up to your head. You have to guess what this thing was, what the purpose was, and what they were doing there, and why they built it. What would you say?
Ritual.
And you don't have to be right. Just your own opinion. Just your own opinion.
Ritual.
Okay.
Seriously, I mean, look, so there's these
Oh,
things going
that
around
makes
where
sense.
archaeologists always explain stuff as ritual. And it's like, well, look at our fucking lives around us. Half of what we do is ritual. Everything we do is really imbued with ritual of some form or another, even just our own daily little fucking routines. And so, sorry. And so, obviously there's some sort of ritual component to this. What ritual? That's where we start extrapolating and we start applying ethnography or more recent history to it. And we can never be really sure. To me, that's sort of like not the wrong kind of question we can ask, but it's the kind of question where we have to be acceptable with a lot of being not so sure, if you see what I mean. And
Well,
so, yeah.
and the reason why when you told me about how there's evidence of beer making possibly or just picking this wild wheat, the first thing I thought about was Elusa. I love this book, by the way. It's an older book. It's an older book by Kyle Kareni, but I haven't found anything that's dug as deep as he did in Eleusinian Mysteries. But the reason why I'm going, and now we're in the classical period. But anyways, I just wanted to compare this as like what humans do. They look at
we eat, we drink.
They look at an aspect of life-giving supplements from the ground, which is wheat or grain, barley, whatever, and they deify it and they say this is life-giving, and then it's almost worthy of worship, and it becomes a goddess, Demeter. And so I look at this is just my own thoughts on this. When I'm looking at Gobekli Tepe, I'm seeing an older sort of version of that, where they're coming to this part of the world and they're finding more life-giving materials, and they're like picking this stuff up, and like, this is a holy spot. This spot saved us, right? Doesn't that make a lot of sense?
I think that spot is definitely something that was sacred to them in some way, form, or shape. I don't know what exactly that meant to that culture, but you think about it, the location of that spot is hugely significant. A, it has a great view. B, it's up high, so it controls this kind of, it commands the plain below. B, it's right where all this wild wheat is. It's right where the gazelle come through. It commands a pass that goes right through the terrain there. So topographically, it's important for food. C, it's got, local stone right nearby for the quarrying of the stone that they do. So it has all the resources that they need. So of course it's going to be a very important location. And then if you think about it, these people are going back there every summer or every spring through the fall for thousands of years. So that they're developing this connection with the land. And that's something that's really important. And we oftentimes look away because, and so what does ritual mean? There's different ways of thinking about it. Look, a historical way is to start thinking of, meaning like a historian, is to start thinking about what is the belief system that these people have. From an archaeological point of view, we're more interested in thinking about what this means to the people, how it brings people together, because that's the kind of evidence we can trace archaeologically, like sort of maybe sometimes some of the rituals people use, but also what we can tell is they're coming together to eat and to drink. Right. And so that's really, really important. And that's something that really carries on through to today. You think about all of our religious ceremonies, and most of them, whether it's before, during, or after, involve eating and drinking, right? This is what brings people together. And so, the same is true in the past as well. Sort of food is the tie that brings everybody together. And it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. You end up with this glut of food. You have to get rid of it. And so you host people. You share it with people. It's sort of like anytime you slaughter an animal, whether you hunt a gazelle, a mammoth, or whether you slaughter an ox or a goat, you're going to feed a lot of people. I used to roast 2 lambs every Easter in Athens for the archaeological expat community, and I would feed 70 people every Easter, and so and these are like 6-month-old lambs. So, you kill like an ox or a gazelle, man, these are going to feed a lot of people. And so, especially if you have a herd of them coming through the pass at the same time, and you can target them because you're smart, capable, Stone Age hunters. And so you know what's coming, you know how to do it, you plan up, you're going to have a glut in meat, just this kind of feast that you cannot believe. And you're going to want to, make sure you do it in the right way, in the right place, decored in the right way with that kind of ceremonial center around it where people can gather and they can, see the work of their ancestors right there, as they are doing exactly what their ancestors did 1,000 years earlier by hunting this herd of gazelle that comes right through the pass at that time. And so, there's something very sacred there. And we can see this, in these groups at different periods, at Knossos, for example. Some of the earliest evidence we have for the city becoming larger right before the palace is built. So, Gobekli Tepe, 10,000 BC. First farmers arrive on Knossos, on Crete, from the sort of Near East area, from Asia Minor or something like that, around 6,500 BC, so 3,000 years later, something like that. And, even then, food is very important. They bring with them sheep, pig, goat, cow, barley, wheat, peas, beans, a bunch of different species of peas and beans, and they bring all this stuff with them to the island. They bring pottery technology with them to the island, and they bring their stone tool technology, these small little stone tools that are designed for, harvesting grain, they bring with them. And so, they find out where to import obsidian to the island from Milos and from Turkey. And so, they have all this know-how of the region that they bring with them, and fairly quickly they start feasting. We start getting deposits. We don't have anything like Gobekli Tepe looking, but we get these deposits full of drinking cups, right? These sort of early forms of drinking cups that show up early for Knossos. And so, we have deposits of them together that probably signify like a group feast where a group of people are coming together, drinking together and eating together. And so, and especially this becomes important because grapes get domesticated by the sort of end of the Neolithic period, early Bronze Age.
From what I've looked up for grapes, because I was talking about this in one of my videos. It was around 6,000 to 5,000 BC, right around the Black Sea region.
I think that's now later. Now I think that's one of those things that's gone down in time. Evie Margariti.
No, I could be wrong
on this.
4,000, maybe that's what it says.
That sounds more right, like 4,000, and I think they get to something like Crete around 3,000. And so that's when we start getting these huge assemblages. I forget what it's called. Peter Tompkins has published on this. These groups of sort of feasting deposits of pottery that show up right at it's called the early Minoan II period. So right around 2,500 to 2,200 BC is this phase that's called the early Bronze Age II. Everywhere you look, whether it's on the mainland in Greece, you have not Lefkandi, you have Lerna, the House of the Tiles at Lerna, and there's other areas with these corridor houses. There are these large structures on mainland Greece. It's the first sign of sort of larger social organization in the very early Bronze Age in the Greek world, and it does not just in Greece. You see it on the islands and the early Cycladic too. So those beautiful marble figurines that are all from like Naxos and Paros and Daskalio, where they have the folded arms. They're all over sort of art and museums. They're called the folded arm figurines. And this is the period of them. Again, this sort of mid third millennium BC. And then at Knossos, that's when you start getting these deposits of feasting material. We have the settlement growing much larger. We have a whole range of settlements around Crete now that are sort of prospering and flourishing. And there's this, and then in the Near East as well, there's a whole lot of, I don't know as much about the Near East in this period, but what I'm about to describe first came from the Near East, though we now know it applies from Greece. But there's this whole flourishing of Bronze Age economies in Greece, and it's the end of the Egyptian Old Kingdom. And so right at this time, we've found that at 2,200 BC, there's climate change that happens. The entire Eastern Mediterranean gets extremely dry and a little colder. And so there's this collapse event that people describe. I mean, collapse of society is a strong term. It's not like everybody dies. But what we see is all this social organization. Everyone becomes a little more regional. There's now smaller settlements. Yeah. It's no longer these kind of larger monumental construction. Like at Lerna, the House of the Tiles, they have this room full of these stamped seals with impressions on them. And so it's like an early form of accounting there. It's not language, but it's like somebody was collecting their, maybe tithes or taxes, and they were stamped the family or whatever seal into this clay. And
That's
so,
awesome.
we have this early kind of documentation in Crete as well, and on the islands we have these sort of symbolism that's becoming more common and more uniform. And so all of a sudden it just disappears. And
Yeah.
so there's this collapse event. But what's really weird is most places there's this what we think of as collapse. There's this intermediate period, the first intermediate period in Egypt, where the old kingdom disappears, and instead Egypt is now very regional until the middle kingdom coalesces again. Different areas in the Near East, it seems like things get regional. Same thing on the mainland and in the islands. But Crete, they are even more resilient. This is right after this period, like 2100, 2000 BC. That's when the very first palace structures get built. The first sort of monumental terracing of the area to build a monumental courtyard that can fit hundreds, thousands of people.
Beautiful.
This is when the scale of these feasting deposits that I'm mentioning, they all of a sudden pick up. It's where it's a period of really beautiful sort of pottery that shows up, just sort of some of the elaborately decorated pottery that you see from the Minoan culture. It occurs during the sort of middle Bronze Age period, middle Minoan.
It's
It's
almost in a way the beginning of the Greek civilization.
Yeah, I mean, that's a kind of term that's tough to apply to much, because the Minoans probably didn't speak Greek. They probably spoke a different language called the Eteocretan language.
Sure.
Now, we're talking about people. Look, everybody in this period, because there's so much intermingling going on. Greek is like an anachronism.
I was going to say, Greek probably has some words from them, but not all of them.
Yeah. Well, so Greek, we see Greek, the first Greek script is that Linear B. Linear A, which is the Minoan script, we know it shares some symbols. I'll get into what those are in a second, but they share some symbols and ideograms, so we can translate a little bit of Linear A. But the reality is for both of these aren't like literary documents. They're not telling stories or letters. They're inventories. And so
But as far as artwork goes, can you see some similarities in the way the Greeks present their artwork with the Minoans?
Yeah, no, I'd actually say it's quite different.
Okay.
The styles and that sort of marine style that you get with Minoan stuff, you don't even see anything much like that in the Greek world until really late Red Figure, where you start getting these fish plates in Italy and elsewhere. These Greek colonies start producing these fish plates, and it's like all of a sudden we have more of the marine stuff. But you do, and in particular, I say it's very different because at the end of the Bronze Age, there was really an abrupt end to artistic traditions in the Greek world at that time. Sort of figurative art really disappears, and it has to start over again with kind of geometric art and stuff like that. And that's something that I delve into a bit with my own research, because now I'm actually more of a later scholar. I focus more on the Bronze Age into the Iron Age and into the Classical period. Yeah. And so we have this flourishing of the Minoans in the Middle Bronze Age, and then in the Minoans, they're writing with the script called Linear A. And so what that is they're stamping these clay tablets with inventories of things. And we know what some of these things are because some of those symbols are the same from Linear B, which we can translate, which is an early form of what we think of as Greek. The language itself is definitely Greek. It was translated by Michael Ventris and others in the 1950s. And so, but since some of these ideograms show up in both, they have the same symbol, usually for like agricultural produce and animals. So like, cow is the same ideogram. Sheep is the same ideogram. So some of them we can translate. We can say this is an inventory for this many sheep and this many cattle, right? That kind of thing. And that's much of what. So in the late Bronze Age, the Minoans are still around at the start of it. And in particular, one of the big events that happens is around the late 17th century. We have the eruption of the volcano at Santorini, at Thera. And so there was a really prosperous Cycladic settlement there, which we think becomes Minoanized, and then maybe even in its last phase becomes Mycenaeanized. So from the mainland, we start having influences from there. But the eruption of this volcano, many people think, we're not sure, it's tough to tell because it is very much prehistory, that might have had a big impact on the Minoan economy. Right.
There was I can't remember this girl's name. She's a scholar about the Minoans. She did a documentary on this exact topic with the eruption and that Thera and all that stuff. She just said yeah. So if there's any connection between early, Mycenaean Greeks and Minoans, this would be the spot where they would pass down.
Well, no, they had connections themselves because Crete is not too far from the mainland. So one of the projects I worked on for a while was the Palace of Nestor in Pylos. I was field director there for a year, and I studied animal remains, and I excavated there as trench supervisor for several years. And so we discovered while I was field director the tomb of the Griffin Warrior. And so in that it's one of the most complete assemblages from a shaft grave. So we think about the start of the Mycenaean period in the Bronze Age, sort of 1600 down to 1200 BCE. So sort of right when this eruption happens, if you see what I mean. And so that starts with what's called the shaft grave era. And now we're going back to that historiography. Heinrich Schliemann was the first one to excavate, grave circle A. And so it was more of grave circle B was discovered in the mid 20th century, and so that was more scanty Heinrich Schliemann stuff that he pulled out, that mask of Agamemnon and all that sort of golden stuff, right? It's not really Agamemnon, it's way too early, it doesn't make any sense, but whatever, that's what he calls it in his romantic way. And so those were unlooted, but so was the shaft grave that we found at Pylos in 2015. We were excavating in sort of on the slope down from one of the Tholos tombs, and on the very first day, me and the trench supervisor, Ali Fields, we identified this sort of corner. And so we expanded the trench, and by the end of the first week, we had, the four sides of it, and we were going down, half a meter into it. It was very clearly a shaft grave. And so the big debate was whether it was looted or not in antiquity, and this was not. It was a full coat of armor, tons of gold and silver. There ended up being, the first thing I came down on. So I was digging in there with a pickaxe because as field director, I tell everybody, look, I'll do this right. I will break one thing. Let's hope it's not the skull or the pelvis, and then we'll continue excavating it. And slower as we should. And so one day I broke off a piece of bronze this big from a vessel that was, bigger than me around. And so it was this big spouted vessel, really thick walls at the top where the rim was. And I broke off this chunk. And so
like a container for something?
Yeah, well, it was probably for mixing wine or something like that, right?
Of course.
Just something huge, a big spouted vessel, something like.
And by the way, Dionysus was around in the Mycenaean period.
Yeah. Lots of drinking. And so certainly the Mycenaeans, they were into that. And so
I saw those inscriptions.
And so that tomb, a lot of the artistic symbolism in it, the people that studied we have a lot of seal rings from there and stuff like that for making seals. There was what was called the combat agate, the Griffin Warrior combat agate, just this beautiful scene on a little seal ring this big, and this beautiful scene of two warriors fighting as if it's out of the Iliad with shields and spears going at each other. We're talking just, a third of an inch is how much this is fit in on. And it's just beautifully intricate down to the millimeter, sub-millimeter, just perfectly engraved. And so there's a lot of connections with those seal rings. A lot of the bull leaping sort of iconography connects with Minoan Crete. And so there's a lot of evidence that probably some of this artwork in that grave were either made by Minoan craftsmen that were local to Pylos or were imported from Minoan Crete. It's unclear. There's no pottery in the tomb. This guy was so wealthy that he had no pottery. There was more metal, just bronze, so much bronze. Yeah. It was, vessels 3 feet, 4 feet across in diameter, and a full suit of bronze, bunch of swords, silver cups, and then gold, little gold jewelry and stuff like that, and ivory combs. It was.
Yeah, I've seen the photos of it, and it's beautiful. Like you said, is this roughly around the same place where the Lion's Gate is?
No, that's Mycenae. That's where Schliemann excavated and found the first grave circle. Yeah.
How far away is that from the? What's the name of this place again that you're talking about?
Pylos, the Palace of Nestor.
Pylos.
Yeah, yeah.
And this
is
different.
So this is all in southern Greece. So you know how Greece is shaped. The very southern part of the peninsula has like 3 fingers.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's kind of like this fourth little knuckle here. That fourth little knuckle. Am I doing it? Let's do it the other way. So this fourth little knuckle.
Ellis?
This is Mycenae.
Yeah.
Mycenae's right here. Pylos is over here.
Oh, we're talking about all the way in the east.
Yeah. Okay. So on the other side, west. So west, maybe I have it wrong.
Yeah,
Sorry, I should have done it like this.
Oh, yeah. I'm seeing it backwards.
Yeah. So this is Mycenae. This is Pylos. And so it's all the way across the Peloponnese. If you were to drive it today, it's probably like a 3-hour drive, but there's also not a nice direct highway that takes you there. If you had a nice direct highway, it might take a little less. But yeah, because they have some good highways going north-south in that region, but not east-west.
But both are Bronze Age, right? Both are Bronze Age?
Both are contemporary. They're both Mycenaean palaces from this sort of 1600 to 1200 period. Yeah, exactly.
I don't know why. I'm just trying to picture this time period in my head and what they were looking like and what they were doing. I mean, it just blows my mind. It's so fascinating.
Yeah, and so some of it is we have to be always really careful about extrapolating what we know better backwards in time.
Yeah.
So, we do this all the time. We create these anachronisms where we look at sort of the way that Homer, for example, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, if there was a Homer, the bards that created it, whatever. We look at it as if it's describing the Bronze Age, and we know that some of it is, but it's part of an oral tradition. So this is great. This whole conversation's connecting, man. So right when Arthur Evans, like I told you, he was an anthropologist and this ethnographer. He went all around the Balkans and started recording, cultural traditions and different people that were living in Romania and Albania, Serbia, that kind of region, right? Before he worked his way down to Crete. Right after Arthur Evans is exploring the Balkans and then he goes down to Knossos, right? The next generation later, 10, 20 years later, there's this guy, Milman Parry, who's doing a study ethnographically of oral storytelling in the Balkan region. So, they still have this in Albania today. My wife is Albanian. So, we always like to, when I teach Homeric poetry to students, I'll play like some verses of this. And it's like a guy reciting kind of a story with a little bit of repetitive musical background. Sort of, you could think about it, rap is like that too. It's very repetitive.
Beat. Isn't that where Rhapsody?
Yeah, exactly.
The word Rhapsody?
Yeah, rhapsode comes from that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, what he realized is you can how do people tell like a 4-hour long story and keep it the same, even the same wording throughout? It's by having these kind of metrical phrases that they can reuse and use over and over again. So like if you read like a translation of the Iliad, it depends who does it and how they do it, but there's these epithets in Greek that are just repeated. So like it's always swift-footed Achilles.
Yeah.
Or, like Agamemnon, King of Kings,
Or Poseidon, the Earth Shaker.
Mm-hmm. And what these little things are, and the reason why deities and heroes have 2 or 3 of them is because it depends on where in the poetic meter they are. They're designed to slot in so that if the word Poseidon shows up here, it can be followed by that epithet because it fits the dum bum dum ba dum ba dum ba dum. You know what I mean? The dactylic hexameter. And so
I love it.
And that was the whole key to unlocking this anthropologist, Milman Parry. Then he sees this in real time with, early 20th century storytellers in the Balkans. And then he's like, wait a second, we can apply this to this poetry, written poetry from ancient Greece. And all of a sudden he realized, and it's been proven right 100 million times, even as we do sort of digital analyses of it, we show that these patterns, my very first grad school paper was a digital analysis of this ending, the genitive ending on this on words to show how it matches up with the poetic meter and how they choose to use that declension when it's depending on which place it is in the poetic line. So there's all these little things that the poet can use to make it fit the meter, and that's how they repeat whole verses, segments, parts, and get it right and get the story right. It's also why there's like whole lines that get repeated, throughout the Iliad and the Odyssey. There's whole, fragments of lines that just get repeated and stuff like that. And so it's because it slots in, and that was what unlocked the whole study of Homeric sort of studies. It was the paradigm shift that was needed to understand, hey, we look at this as oral poetry, and we can start to unlock how it was composed. We can start to unlock also how it has some reflections from different periods in time in the past. And so that's when you can start applying archaeology to it. You can start to say, all right, let's look at the weapons and the armor that show up in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and let's see how they compare, to what we find in graves, or what we see painted on pots, or what we see, sculpted in stone, right? And it turns out that in the Iliad, there's different kinds of spears that are described. One's a big one that you'd sort of stab people with. The other one's a short one that you throw. And that matches on very well to the big ones, the Bronze Age style spear. The one that you throw is an Iron Age style spear. We have shields and other descriptions of things that map onto Iron Age versus Bronze Age material culture. And so there's this memory of this kind of material from the Bronze Age that's in there that people were not using at the time it was written down. This material was already 500 years old. Some of them might have seen some of it because they sometimes went into Bronze Age tombs and did tomb cults and stuff like that. But
they probably had scholars back then, not the level we're at today, but there probably are people who are studying different, like you said, they're going into tombs and looking at what's in there, and they're reading ancient texts, and they're passing down their traditions, right? I mean,
probably less so the texts, because it was a different kind of
it wasn't a textual time period.
Alphabet. Well, there was different alphabet. Nobody used linear B, and then the next time, so yeah, let's think about that. So the Bronze Age is flourishing. People are going on. Some people think the Mycenaeans conquered Crete. Other people's don't. Who the hell knows? It's unclear. What we do see is a major change in the final period on Crete, where there was all these palaces. So there were kind of Minoan city-states, if you will, where, Knossos controlled part of the center of the island. Festos to the south might have been its port. We don't know, but it's another palace. Yeah.
Not to cut you off, but Homer in the Iliad talks about Crete. And he goes into this
briefly,
he says there's 70 cities there. He says surrounded by the capital, which is Knossos, and then he talks about there being Pelasgians there too, which is another term.
The Pelasgians you got to be careful with. That's something that everybody claims everywhere.
Right.
my wife is really into this. She's an archaeologist and historian as well.
Let me tell you my theory about Pelasgians. This is a sort of an umbrella term that people like Homer and Herodotus and all these ancient great classical authors and bards and poets are using just to sort of describe the people before them.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah, I like that. That's exactly what I'd say. As with other groups, you sort of get this tradition that comes out of Thucydides of this Dorian invasion, sort of at the end of the Bronze Age. We now know there's nothing like that. It's some sort of, I don't know where the hell it comes from. We don't know where the hell it comes from.
I've heard some people say they came from the north. Some people say they came from the south. Some people say they came from Ionia. I'm like,
but they didn't come anywhere. There was no coming in that sense in the least. There's no invasion. And so, so it's just something that it's a mishmash, especially this early history. It's these weird memories that come down in different ways and were combined and amalgamated in different ways that we can't use it as history, if you see what I mean. And we need to instead reflect on how it was constructed. That gives us a much better sense of what it is. We can find sometimes connections.
It reminds me, the Dorian invasion is kind of a good example to compare the Exodus to, because if we look at the Exodus, and scholars are like, we can't find an Exodus to what they're describing, but there is this Hyksos explosion, and that may be connected through some sort of memory that sort of gets like a game of telephone, and then all of a sudden the Hyksos explosion becomes this giant Exodus. So that could be kind of what it is, maybe something similar.
Yeah, or it could be an adaptation of a different myth from a different group. There's just so many.
So
many options.
You know who Maria Backfarova is, right? Mary Backfarova, I think her name is. She's a scholar of the Hittites, I think, but I think she's a classicist too. I could be wrong, but whatever. She wrote a book. She wrote a book arguing with really good evidence that Homer's Iliad looks a lot like some of these ancient Near Eastern stories of. So there's,
this whole, like I said, there's so many connections between these areas, between the Greek world, between Anatolia, between the Black Sea, between the Levant, between Egypt. And so, we see all the time in all these periods, really since the Bronze Age onward, since that early Bronze Age 2 period that I mentioned. And that's where Colin Renfrew, I think he described it as this sort of international culture that was appearing at that time. And so since that time, really, we have really strong connections throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. And we know from shipwrecks that there's this kind of, let's do it the right way. So wait, that's your east. So you go from Egypt up the Levant, across Anatolia, and then down to Crete. It's this circle that the currents take you in. I can't do that with my finger very well because I have to go backwards.
You show it on
And
the
so-
screen when you're not.
yeah,
Yeah.
And so there's this circular way that the ships would take with their currents, and all of our shipwrecks show this. We see this sort of cabotage where ships stop at one port, they unload some supplies, they pick up some new supplies, so we can see the step-by-step route that ships take when they end up being shipwrecked and on the bottom of the sea, and we excavate them. And so from fairly early on, even before there's these huge ships, where during the early Bronze Age with smaller ships, that's when we think that this international culture starts from sailing. And we just see all this connections across the Eastern Mediterranean. We end up from really early on, we end up having Egyptian stuff on Crete. In the Middle Bronze Age, we have Egyptian stone vessels, we have scarabs on Crete. This is how we did a lot of dating, was through these Egyptian connections before radiocarbon was developed. And so at the same time, we have depictions of Minoans. Eric Klein has argued on Cretan or on Egyptian frescoes. And when you look at the kind of texts that exist in Linear B that we can translate really well, in this sort of Greek world, the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, whatever you want to call them, in the Aegean world is actually a better term for it because it doesn't have that modern connotation of Greece. But in the Aegean world, it seems like that the elites were really the top of the economy was textiles. We know that outside of Knossos in the late Bronze Age and Linear B, so now in Greek writing, with maybe the Mycenaeans were ruling there, we don't know. But there's, flocks of sheep, 30,000 large. And these are just the male castrates. Right. And so, that means there's even larger flocks that are supporting this population of male castrated sheep that give good wool. And so we have these huge herds of sheep. And then most of the other documents, if they don't deal with sheep, they deal with people that are weaving wool or decorating wool. The whole process of making wool is controlled by these sort of palatial entities. And so a lot of people think that they're exporting this kind of woolen products with their symbols on them, decorated, woven in and decorated, dyed probably with purple dye from the snail shells on Crete at Creasy Island. Yeah. From the Bronze Age onwards, Tom Brogan and Dimitra Milana, they've excavated an industrial purple dye manufacturing workshop there.
I read that paper.
Great. Yeah. So it's not just Tyrian purple. A lot of people think it comes out of Phoenicia. No, it's all over. Yeah. And so it's just wherever that shell.
Wherever the shell is, right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, not the shell. That's what we find.
Oh,
it's wherever the snail is that has the gland in it. Yeah. But so textiles were just such a huge deal, and we get a sense of these kind of palatial economies, if you see what I mean, and some sense of their religious rituals. So we have sacrificial rituals in these sort of more feasting rituals is the right way to put it. We can see that people are gathered together. We can also see that the palace, for example, the tablets at Pylos, one of the things that they controlled at the palace were these pairs of plow oxen. And so they were very careful about when and where plow oxen would go throughout the landscape around Pylos, probably lending them to large landowners who would then repay them later on with something else like wool from their sheep, or with sacrificial victims for a feast, or with wine, stuff like that. And so that's how these palatial economies kind of worked. They controlled certain segments of the economy, particularly wool, wheat, and plow oxen seem to be some of the really big parts of it. And then they collected kind of olive oil and wine and stuff like that. And then they host these really big feasts. And so we have evidence of that from Linear B, where we have evidence of them sacrificing these animals, and we can count up how many people that would feed approximately. And it's, thousands. And then we can see this as well in the very room. So if you enter the Palace of Nestor, right on your left is the archives room. When the palace burns down around 1200 BCE, these tablets, they're just temporary, right? The only reason we have these Linear B and A tablets is just pure random luck, right? And the reason why we have a lot of Linear B tablets is because of the palaces being destroyed by fire, because these were just temporary accounts. So they're recording temporary things on these clay tablets. They store them. And then we even have this in real time in this archives room in the Palace of Nestor, where we can see in one area, they have old tablets that they're going to melt in water and turn into new tablets that they can inscribe new documents on. And so probably long-term documents were stored on papyrus or something like that. These were just their temporary working accounts. And when the palace was destroyed, whatever was there temporarily got baked, and that's what we're left with, is just that last little snapshot of the operations in these palaces sort of right before they were destroyed. That's why there's not much linear A, because it's the final destruction of these palaces in the end of the Bronze Age, sort of the end of the LH3B period, it's called, but around 1200 BCE, where many of these palaces were destroyed by fire, and that preserved these kind of documents for us. And we have several large archives at Pylos, where the archives room is, at Knossos, and then at Thebes. And then we have a smaller number of tablets from other sites like Mycenae or Icklina or elsewhere, or sometimes on pottery as well. We get a few of these ideograms inscribed or stamped on them. And so, yeah, so that's kind of what we have from that. And so what's cool is, you think about what carries on down. We talked about this Homeric tradition, preserving some of it. But as we know, certain aspects of religious ritual also get preserved. So some of the deities are the same names. You mentioned Dionysus, for example, or Demeter, or there's others, I think.
Zeus.
Huh?
Zeus.
Yeah, Zeus. Yeah. So we have a number of them that carry on through. And it's funny because this disproves what the Greeks say about Dionysus. The Greeks say in the classical period that he was imported from the East. And it's like, no, he wasn't. We know he was there already from linear B tablets.
Unless he was imported from the East before the Minoans. But that would be like a really crazy,
who knows? Yeah.
That could be a really distant passed down thing that they could have. That's possible.
But maybe there's just this
now we're getting unlike
I
get what you're speaking for that.
Yeah, and so like this
is because why, you want to know what I'm thinking they're doing. There's this god Sabazius in the East. He's a barley god, but it's very similar. He's a possession, divine mania god, right? And so they can be linking. I think that's what they're thinking. They're like, oh, this is the Eastern.
Yeah, well, this is all this syncretism is what we call it in scholarship, where sort of one deity becomes associated with another, like, Aphrodite and Venus.
Usually for good reasons, though. Usually
for good reasons, but at the same time, they're still different, if you see what I mean. One of the things I always try to get across to students is that polytheism just doesn't work like monotheism does. When we think of Jesus Christ, there's one Jesus Christ that we're all thinking of. We're all thinking of the same figure, if you see what I mean. But when an ancient Greek thought of Athena, there's so many iterations of Athena. There's Athena the warrior, there's Athena the virgin, there's Athena for the city, there's Athena for the wise, there's so many different, and they're all very different.
Then you get Plato saying that the Egyptians worship Neith, and that's the same as, they say that's the same as Athena. And then the Romans are like, well, we have Minerva, and she's basically the same as Athena. And they play this little syncretism game, and it's kind of, I actually like that kind of stuff. I don't know why.
Oh, it's totally cool. And so they're certainly equivalent, but I guess part of what I'm trying to say is they're also still very different. The way they worship them, the way they show up iconographically, the way that people come together.
Even two different Zeuses can be different.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
The Zeus of Dodona and the Zeus down in Olympia have two different traditions. They have different myths about them. And then it's not until later where they start to wove these myths together. And you get like, oh, it's metamorphosis, where it's like one coherent story. You know what I mean? So
exactly, and that's the syncretism. But at the same time, they still, even into the Roman period, they maintain their differences. And so, and that's where I think of, what we think of when we think of as deity is the literary version. The Athena that shows up in the Iliad, but that Athena is never really worshipped, if you see what I mean. That never. That's not the source of worship. And so the Iliad was not like the Bible. It didn't tell the stories that people used to worship on. Instead, it sort of just represented a mythical past to the Greeks, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's two. You can't look at Iliad or Hesiod, for example, or any of these divine theogonies or epics the way you look at the Bible. Because they're written sort of like they reflect nature, they reflect emotions, they reflect different things that happen in daily lives. It's not more of like this happened and you better do this or else. Like there's nothing. It's not. They're like, it's totally not the same thing.
Yeah. No. It's just a very, very different, and it's a very different way of thinking about religion. They didn't have the same concept of faith. They didn't have the same concept of belief. There wasn't until Eleusis, really, gets established in the Greek world,
Or
this
salvation.
concept of salvation and an afterlife. And so, there's just these concepts were very different. Instead, religion was much more how archaeologists think about it, which is it's about community. It's about bringing people together. It's about having traditions and rituals that express identity and group identity and things like that. And so, group membership even. And Eleusis certainly tied into that. That was all about group membership after all.
Say, Eleusis starts off that way as the Bronze Age, right? But then as it progresses, it becomes this initiation where if you want to be saved, you want to go to Elysium. You don't want to go to the regular Hades where everybody's just dwelling and pissed off, or a better, or even worse, Tartarus, where you're going to have the worst time. You want to go to Elysium, and that's because, and the only way to get to Elysium is you have to be initiated into the mysteries. Demeter and the daughter Corey, and you better do it. And they're like, all right, everybody, and it's this famous initiation ritual. It's amazing. I love it.
Oh, and it picks up. We end up getting Eleusinians all over the Mediterranean because the Romans love it. So the Romans all come in to get initiated, and it's just.
And even Nicholas of Damascus talks about people from India traveling all the way to go get initiated. And so this is, to me, this sort of is like the beginning of international organized religion in a way, is like the Eleusinians.
Well, yeah, and it's the beginning of what so look, I mean, many scholars think of Christianity as a mystery cult. It's developing out of this tradition that Eleusis was part of. There's a lot of them too. Mithras is another big one, and Dionysus later on becomes more of a mystery cult. And this idea of initiation and salvation, and the idea that early on, cult, like I said, it had a lot to do with group identity and identity, but in place. It's where your family lives and where it's from. With Eleusis, like you said, it becomes a little more international. It doesn't matter what your status is. You can be an enslaved person and still be initiated in the Eleusinian mysteries. It doesn't matter where you're from. You don't,
Sorry, I keep cutting you off, but
no, you're fine.
Right. It doesn't matter where you're from. And there's actually a story of why that happened. And Carl Kareni covers this. And you're right. Eleusis was only for people in Attica or whatever.
First,
close region. And then they initiated somebody from out of town. I forgot who it was. It was somebody from somewhere else. And it started an uproar. How could you initiate somebody who's not one of us? And the Hierophant at the time said, what about Heracles? We had the story of Heracles getting initiated.
He's a foreigner.
Started using a case law type of argument, started a new precedent. And then after that, everybody can be initiated. Yeah. And I love that part of his book because
it was like that with Philip II and the Olympics. Right. Yeah. So with the Olympic Games, it's the same idea where it's one of those international things where people come, but it's only Greeks. And then all of a sudden, Philip II wants to join. And so now it becomes widened until eventually Romans and other people start competing later on. And so, it's just sort of the same idea. Yeah. And a big uproar at the time, but he's Macedonian. And so it's like,
Yeah. They're almost like the backwaters of the Greeks, right? In some ways.
But another way that we can see this kind of continuity between the Bronze Age and down through the Iron Age and into the Classical period relates to what I study. So I study ancient animal bones. And so sacrificial ritual is one of the key sources of evidence for ritual continuity. So it's in the late Bronze Age period where the people living in the Aegean world, they start burning animal bones as a kind of ritual. And so, like we have in those archives room that I mentioned at the Palace of Nestor and Pylos, we have a deposit of burned animal bones of cattle and red deer. And it's only the thigh bone, the humerus or the upper front leg bone, or the mandible. And so it's very carefully selected. And since it's in the archives room, it's probably a receipt in a sense of this event or events that happened. And there's a few different deposits in the archives room. The largest one, my supervisor, Paul Halstead and Valencia Izakidou, they studied this together. And I work with Valencia at Knossos to study animal remains. And they estimated that it could feed, I think, a couple thousand people. This event, the largest of these deposits. There's a series of these deposits of these burned bones acting as receipts. And so, that kind of sacrificial ritual, it shows up at a number of different sites. It's a little different in the late Bronze Age. It's kind of variable. So it's the thigh bone, the humerus, and the mandible at Pylos. at Calipodi, and Lycaon. Both are sanctuary sites that start during the Bronze Age, where we have some early Bronze Age layers, mainly just sacrifice bones, and then they continue down into the classical period. It's the burned thigh bones only. Okay,
Yeah.
and this will matter in a second. I promise. It'll all make sense. I have an article coming out on this soon, and then at Eleusis, actually, there's a small assemblage of Bronze Age burned bones, and they are all. And then this other sanctuary. So let's go back to the Peloponnese. Right here, near Mycenae, further down here, there's this little peninsula called Methana Peninsula. There's this sanctuary there called God damn it, like blanking on my stupid names, and I'm publishing on this stuff. Methana. Sorry, I'm Methana. Ios Konstantinos is what it's called today. We don't have an ancient name for it. So at Ios Konstantinos and at Eleusis, it's the lower legs of pigs that are being burned.
Yeah.
And so
sacred to Demeter.
Yeah. And so there's these weird different patterns that go on, and this does not jive very well.
To get initiated, you had to bring a pig. You had to bring your own.
Yeah, it's at Eleusis. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so you've read the Iliad and the Odyssey, right?
Of course.
So there's dozens and dozens of sacrificial scenes. Do you remember
every other scene? And even the Greek Alexander romance, every 5 minutes, Alexander sacrifices his god.
Of course. Yeah. All sorts of ancient texts are like that. Yeah. So so what did they sacrifice?
Goats.
No, mostly cattle, but I meant what body part gets burned.
What body part gets burned?
Yeah.
I don't remember. I don't know if I've ever paid attention to that part. It's
always the thigh bone. Okay. It's always the thigh bone. And this matters. So the reason why it matters is because in the Bronze Age, sometimes it's the thigh bones, like at Calipodi and at Lycaon, it's the thigh bones. At Pylos in the Palace of Nestor, it's the thigh bone, the humerus, and the mandible. But then it's the lower legs of these pigs. And at some other sites, it's some different things. I have lower legs of sheep that I published on Crete at Halasmenos in Eastern Crete. That's also late Minoan period. And so there's this diversity, in a sense, in which body parts are being burned. And this carries on down to the Iron Age in a certain way, where you get into the early Iron Age. It's still right around when Homer's writing, let's say. No, writing, whatever, if Homer's a person, that kind of stuff. And so at that time, there's still some diversity, but it seems like the larger sanctuary sites, it's now mostly thigh bones. But at the smaller sanctuary sites, it's lower legs. And then by the classical period, the lower legs almost all disappear, except for in household sacrificial deposits. And so what I think is that people are responding to Homer. Homer makes it orthodox. You only burn the thigh bone. And then a few hundred years later, people are saying, that's how Homer describes things. So that's how we need to do things at sanctuaries.
Right.
And so they see Homer as describing what their ancestors do. So this is one of the articles I have coming out. And so it's just like, it's how people respond to the way they tell stories. Because it's at that. So it's funny though, is in the Iron Age when Homer's around, if he's around, is people aren't eating much meat at all. There are some animal sacrifice, but like if you look at the isotopes in their bones, the amount of animal protein people consume in the Iron Age is really piss poor. People are mostly starving. But by the classical period, people are on average eating a lot more animal protein. They're having much larger sacrificial feasts. They're now living in large cities, and they see these sacrifices from Homeric poetry. And probably back in the Iron Age, the people are like, oh, I'm so hungry, I want meat. I'm listening to this story about everybody stuffing their face with meat, and it's like food porn. To the people in the classical period, it's like, that's how our ancestors did it, so we're going to do it like this. Right. And so it has a totally different meaning for them.
This to me is so fascinating because even in today's day and age, we're all influenced by the medias, the movies and films and music we listen to, and it sort of sculpts through this inspiration of the poet, right, the bard, but even in today's world, the artist inspires us, and it shapes who we are. We get inspired by them, not for good reasons, not in some like oh, they're making us do, no, we're inspired by amazing people who inspire us. This is how the world works, right? Of course. And so Homer's doing this, but like imagine, I'm gonna give it this is something I just looked into recently. Euripides performs the Bacchae at Athens in front of the whole sold out crowd. and it's this tragic story. And at the end, Agave is weeping, and Dionysus is standing in front of her, and they're talking, and that's how it ends. Curtains drop. A year later, this is how you can look this up. A year later is the big famous 30 tyrants being removed from and democracy replacing. And I'm thinking to myself, Dionysus has this democratic spirit within him, where he sort of overthrows the tyrant, Pentheus. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, I wonder if this was such an inspiring time period where these great poets and artists inspiring the people, and they're being educated and they're learning about, maybe we can rise up too. The date premiered 405 BC. Now look at this 30 tyrants event. 404 BC, the Athenians decided to respond. They destroyed at the Battle of
So I think we need to figure out when in 405 BC these things happened, because the 30 tyrants started ruling in 405 BC as well.
Well, I'm not talking about when it all started. I'm just saying when they decided to go and revolt is a year after.
I just meant to see the commentary, see if Euripides was commenting on the tyrants, if the tyrants were already ruling.
No, I'm not saying this is a fact.
Okay.
All I'm saying is.
No, but I'm saying we could test this. We could actually test this is what I'm trying to say. I don't know.
Good point. Let's play off that. Because all I'm saying is, look, we have this amazing world classic that people still read today, and it's inspiring people. And then a year later, this is amazing revolution where democracy comes and takes over. And I'm just saying, maybe there's a connection. But you're saying we can actually test this.
I'm saying we could see if Euripides was writing this in response to these tyrants, because the tyrants started in 405 BC, the 30 tyrants. They were overthrown in 404. So depending on when this was performed, it could have been very much direct. It might also be that people have dated the Bacchae to that period because they think it's commenting on it. So therefore we have a circular argument going, is what I'm trying to say. I'm
open to that.
Maybe that doesn't prove anything. We have to see.
The point that I was trying to bring up is that these bards, these famous poets, Sappho, Lesbos, and all these great minds and thinkers, and they inspire us, and they change the world, and they dictate the direction of society. And that's what I was saying, because you brought up how people are sacrificing based on what they read in Homer. It's just fascinating how that can be true, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that's important too. I think that there's this goal to sort of read what was Homer's intent here, and so then we go to some classical scholars that talk about, or Hellenistic scholars or Roman scholars that write about Homer, and what we need to recognize is that those Hellenistic scholars or Roman scholars were writing about their own perspective on Homer, who was writing 300 years earlier. And so sometimes our goal is not to get at what was Homer trying to say. Sometimes our goal is to understand how a classical Athenian might have understood Homer, or how a Roman scholar might have understood Homer. That's actually, or how a medieval, individual might have understood Homer, or how someone in the Renaissance might have, or how someone today living in Greece versus someone today living in the UK. Like, how does Boris Johnson understand Homer? Is something that somebody could easily write an article on, because he quotes Homer all the time. And so, it's sort of like there's all these different Homers that exist, because Homer means something different to each one of us. And different people in the past, based on which culture they come from, they read those texts in a very different way. For military veterans, they very much read those texts in a very different way than somebody who's not a military veteran, because it's such a description of war, and then coming home from war with the Odyssey, and everything's always just a jumble, and veterans relate to it in a huge way. And so, we're all going to pick up different things here and there, because it's such a rich story, and it inspires us in so many different ways.
Yeah. And to last topic I want to get into now, because we were talking about the Eleusinian mysteries. We're talking about the sacrifices. We're talking about religion. And I've read a little bit of Galen. I've read a little bit of Hippocrates. I've read a little bit of Dioscorides. Not a lot, obviously. It's dense stuff. Okay. Just to flip through, just to see what they're talking. Like, I just flip through it. Hey, what does he say here? Oh, wow, there's a lot of names of different drugs, basically. So by the time we get to Galen, we have a whole textbook, multiple textbooks full of knowledge of drugs, medicine.
Of course, yeah.
But a lot of this isn't just medicine. Some of it's for like the Eleusinian mysteries, where they have Kykeon. When do we start seeing what ancient on the top of ancient drugs? When do we start seeing this in the archaeology? How far back can we
Oh,
go?
very early. I mean, like, it depends on, look, so you have to define drug in a very broad sense. We think of drugs as mind-altering substances, and we classify them fucking legally and culturally. For some reason, we don't classify coffee and alcohol as a drug, right? But that certainly
Certainly a drug.
alters our mind, right? And so we also don't think of poisons as a drug, because if we take too much of us, it kills us, like nightshade, right? You know, is a good example of something that if you take a small amount, you're going to be intoxicated. If you take too much, you're going to be dead. So I don't advise anybody to take henbane or nightshade or things like that. But ancient Greeks took that shit sometimes to get high, right? And we know today, with the problem with drug overdoses, how drugs can kill us. I have friends that have died of drug overdoses. And so, you know, but we generally think of drugs as things that are more safe to tolerate, take in a certain amount. You smoke pot, you drink alcohol, most people get by without dying from that kind of stuff, right? Because it's a relatively safe. I don't think anybody's ever died from pot, but alcohol, obviously people die of alcohol poisoning. So, you know, we have to expand what we think of as drugs. And so in the archaeological record, we have, obviously we recover plants that are partially carbonized or preserved in waterlogged deposits. And we sample the sediments for these and we find them. We can find very early in the Stone Age evidence of kind of intoxicating plants. So, you know, it seems that likely that even in the Paleolithic, people were ingesting mind-altering substances. Certainly down by the time wheat and grains are domesticated, we very early on have evidence for beer, we think. And probably even and at Gobekli Tepe, this is not with domesticated wheat. These are hunter-gatherers that are in the same place long enough that they're probably brewing beer. And so, you know, likewise, with the earlier culture that precedes Gobekli Tepe, the Natufians, they're entirely hunter-gatherers, but they're moderately sedentary. They're kind of like Gobekli Tepe type.
How do we know this? How can archaeology look at a dig and say, hey, they were doing drugs here? Like, what is the process like?
Well, so it's an inference in a sense. It's tough to be 100% sure until later on, because what we can say is these plants are available, and the most likely explanation for it is some sort of mind-altering thing. Now, it might have been a mind-altering reason related to medicine. You know, up until the 19th century, one of the most important medications available was opium, you know, because it's such an effective painkiller. And so, you know, we didn't have our more modern, more safe painkillers that we use today. And so, you know, we definitely think that these, when we find mind-altering substances, that they're probably being used. We don't really doubt that. There's all kinds of reasonable inferences that maybe some cave paintings were influenced by taking drugs. That's a harder one to demonstrate, because who the hell knows? Cave paintings are pretty cool. There's flickering light. They're already in a mind-altered environment. If you think about it, so deep into a cave, you might not need drugs to trip out.
Yeah, this is one of those topics that I know I'm biased in. I want it to be true. Like, I talked to Gutsick Gibbon about this because I told her I'm what what's his name? Shit, I can't remember his name. I can't remember his name. He was a famous psychonaut writer. Anyways, shit, I just on the tip of my tongue and I forgot it. But anyways, he's like this stoned ape theorist guy.
Oh yeah, I've read some of that. Yeah, so
whatever his name is, and I'm fascinated. This is such a fun topic, but we can't. Gutsick was like, "Look, we can't say that's true."
I mean, the stoned ape thing is just it's pseudorscience in the sense that it's not falsifiable.
Right, but I said, I go, look,
yeah,
the evidence isn't there. I'm fine with that. I just want it to be true.
But did people probably alter their mind that long ago? Yes. Did that impact our evolution? Who the hell knows? That's a far more complex question. That's not really
more complex question.
And so, you know, but did people from early on, probably when people were just collecting fruits, look, fruits, you can't help but have grapes turn into wine. You
Right.
just leave grapes in a friggin' barrel for
Ferment.
like a few weeks, they start fermenting,
Yeah.
especially without refrigeration. There's no way to stop. So, when people are eating fruits, and most likely hominins are eating fruits in Africa, and when Homo erectus goes out, they're probably at times having fermented fruit. And same thing, we see apes and like modern apes that have fermented fruit, if you see
You
what I mean.
can
And
almost
so,
understand why they would think they're being possessed by a deity.
yeah,
Some sort of
yeah. And so,
ancient version of Dionysus, not calling it Dionysus, but like, oh, the gods are taking me over again. Woo!
but we start getting, in a sense, with alcohol, is when we first start getting really clear evidence, because we have the residue of the alcohol, sort of the grains in cups, right, in bowls and cups, and then when we get wine as well. And so, but later on, by the Bronze Age, opium becomes a very big deal. We have these jars that even look like opium poppies, residue from Cyprus. Residue analysis has been done on them, and many of them held opium products. And so, and they were traded all over from beyond Cyprus. And so, and then I have a video that I'm in the process of finishing up that I'll put out on my YouTube about narcotics and the Greco-Roman magic spells. That was what my honors thesis was on as an undergrad. I was really into researching ancient drugs as an undergrad when I was at Penn. And
Can you give us a
so
little bit of the details on what exactly was like some of the stuff they were doing?
everything is the answer there. There's a lot of evidence for narcotics in the Greek magical papyri. It's the Papyri Graecae Magicae.
Yeah.
And they're basically magicians' handbooks that were recorded from the Roman period in Egypt. And so they're sort of a collection of spells on a single papyrus roll for divination. So to meet a deity and have a dream and predict the future.
And
or
there's a lot of mixture with Jewish concepts with
Oh, yeah.
Greco.
These are the ultimate syncretism. We were talking
Oh.
about syncretism. This is filled with Judaism, Christianity, Greek gods, Roman gods, Near Eastern gods. Every single deity from around the Mediterranean is basically referenced there. Egyptian
By the way, the
gods.
logo of my channel, I don't know if you saw it, Abraxas, that's from the Greek magical papyri.
Yeah, Abraxas. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the original abracadabra, which was ablathanalba, which is spelled the same way front to back in Greek, that's actually in there repeated. So what we think of as a magical word, abracadabra, it comes from this kind of tradition as well, with the ablathanalba. And so they have longer palindromes as well, and they have all kinds of magical words that we can't translate in there. But they also have a deep connection with plants, and a very deep connection with plants. And they use a whole lot of narcotic plants or mind-altering plants. And this, again, we have to expand our mind on what a drug is, because there's a lot of poisons in there. Things that we would think of as poisonous, where they're taking much smaller quantities, where probably sometimes they're poisoning themselves, and then other times they're having some sort of crazy experience. Things like nightshade. There's this one spell where they rub nightshade all over their body, and then they hallucinate and they see a deity that tells them, predicts their future for them. And so we have a hint of this from 1,000 years later, 1600 AD. We have Johann Weyer, who describes these witches in medieval Europe that rub nightshade all over their body and think they're flying. And so it's almost the exact same kind of idea. And so what my thesis was on was wormwood. That's the active ingredient in absinthe that you add to absinthe to give it a little more of a kick. And so that's mentioned a lot. That's mentioned in 21 different spells. It's also mentioned in a couple different contexts as being a code ingredient, where there could be other times where it's hidden in a spell's wine that somebody drinks, or in the incense they burn, or in the ink that they write with. But to make the ink, you burn plants, and you take the ash and you make the ink from that ash oftentimes. And so they burned opium for ink, they burned wormwood for ink, they burned henbane for ink, things like that. Yeah.
And there's a passage in the Against Heresies text that Hippolytus writes about these Gnostic people. One of them's name was Marcus Magus. That was his title.
Of course. Yeah. Simon the Magus, maybe. Yeah.
He's from that line of thinking.
Okay. Yeah.
He was actually a disciple of Valentinus, who was a disciple of somebody who was a disciple.
I see. Yeah. Later. Yeah. I gotcha.
And this guy Marcus was charged with, or according to Hippolytus, was accused of adding some sort of substance to the Eucharist and giving him to
Mhm.
people so that they can have trip out and see Jesus and have. So there's some evidence.
Huh. You
Even
should send me the reference for that.
I'll
I'd be
send you
interested.
the screenshot. I have it right
Yeah,
here. Yeah, I have it right
great.
next. I'll send you that. Yeah, I would love to see what you do with it because you could tie it into what you're doing. But that aside, another thing you see a lot is in the sources is root cutters. Usually
Mhm.
it's women, and it's like some divination, root cutters.
Exactly.
It
Yeah.
turns out that DMT is extracted from roots. So it's like
Well,
I'm
there's all
not
kinds
saying
of
it's the same
plant
thing, but
picking
like
spells.
yeah,
So, like, even in the magical papyri, they have these spells to pick a plant, and you sort of burn incense for the leaves, for the stem, and for the roots. And like you speak a spell, like Alba or whatever it is, and yeah, and so it's actually totally intense, and they have this crazy connection with plants. And I mean, I just to end this, I want to emphasize that mind altering in the past was not only drugs though. So, we do this today too. So if you ever go, you'll get a kick out of this. You got to read Aelius Aristides. He is this Greco-Roman, so he's in the Roman period, but he's from Asia Minor, so he's Greek, and he writes in Greek and speaks in Greek. And he has this kind of autobiography that he records. I think it's from the 2nd century AD. And it's basically him going around the Mediterranean, and it's all broken up in different decades of his life. It just jumps around in time. And it's basically how he trips out and talks to God. And he's this really wealthy, he's always very sick. He's very sickly, but he's like a really important priest, and he gives speeches to crowded audiences from Rome. He knew like wealthy people and the emperor in Rome to all over the Eastern Mediterranean. He went to Egypt and stuff like that. And he takes a lot of drugs. Wormwood is one of the drugs that he takes several times, and it's his favorite. But he drinks a lot. He takes kufi and different kinds of substances that have different plants in it. But he does a lot more to trip out. It's not only drugs. He might not eat for a week, and then he'll eat a whole chicken, right? And so, how do you think you're going to feel if you don't eat for a week and then you stuff your face with a chicken? You're going to be kind of tripping out as well. Or
yeah.
in the middle of winter, he'll get naked, he'll run around in the snow, and they'll go swimming in the frozen stream, right? Or he'll take one of those poisons, this poisonous root called hellebore, and he takes it. For all these things, by the way, it always goes with him speaking to God, right? His God. He has his personal God. It's probably a version of Asclepius, because he was mostly a priest of Asclepius.
Yeah.
And
Oh yeah.
so he always has these dreams of him and stuff like that. But one of my favorite stories is he takes this root hellebore, he starts tripping out, and he's a rich guy, so he's a priest. He has this huge entourage that's always with him, and so he's like, "All right, guys, let's go sailing." So they go sailing. He takes some more hellebore, and then the deity tells him, "Now crash the ship." So he crashes the ship. They shipwreck, and they have to all get back to shore. And so this is his experience, right? This is how he goes about, is doing whatever he can to talk to God. And it's all kinds of
Yeah.
different methods to induce this kind of mindset that connects with them. Yeah.
I know we're closing out, but real quick, just because that seems to be something common with the followers of Asclepius slash Ophiuchus, and in the aliens that go to Italy, so Parmenides and those guys, they were setting up these incubation or places, I don't know, the temples or whatever, where they would take people who were sick and they would put them under an incubation and then have them report what their dreams were and all this. And these were like followers of Apollo and Asclepius. Asclepius is Apollo's son. But yeah, and then I think in the time period you're talking about, Asclepius sort of gets linked up with Serapis, and they sort of becomes this guy. Becomes this guy who's known for giving people
giving dreams,
dreams, right,
and healing, yeah. And so, in fact, Aelius Aristides, I think he goes down and visits priests of Serapis in Egypt, where they give him kufi with his wine. And kufi, it depends on it's a recipe. We have several recipes for kufi, mostly later in the Byzantine period, but a lot of those recipes include different narcotic substances. It's like 30 different ingredients in this little pellet that you then drop into your wine and stir in and mix up. Most of it's just kind of incense type stuff like herbs, but some of it is oftentimes narcotics. And so, yeah, or
that's probably why the gospel authors have Jesus healing everybody, because he's got to compete with all these other healers. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's part of this whole mystery incubation. I mean, so if you read like Peter Brown on sort of like the holy man idea that starts popping up in this period, sort
Right.
of like the early Roman period everywhere, you get these figures. Simon the Magus is a good example of one.
Perfect example.
These kind of figures, and Aelius Aristides is a later example of one, and it's sort of almost what breaks the sort of polytheism in the end is because these charismatic sort of holy people, they sort of create this new thing where everybody's looking for salvation. They're looking for something further beyond just community, if you see what I mean. And so, and yeah, and the Roman Empire being everywhere with all their imperial cult as well that people had to participate in, it just created this different political, social, cultural, religious milieu where figures like this somehow thrive.
Apollobius Tiana might be one of these examples.
Yeah, that's another
Yeah.
great one. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And it's interesting because the Severan dynasty was the one there. I forget which one. I think it was Julia Domna. She's the one who was the patron of Philostratus. She funded him to write the story about Apollonius of Tyana. But also her sister Julia Mamaea was a Christian noblewoman. So from this family, you get they're like, oh, we're patrons of all these different exotic religions.
Exactly, because they're polytheistic. To them, all religions are fine. It's funny that religious intolerance requires monotheism.
Right.
Because in polytheism, you're accepting of everything because you're fine with worshiping a bunch of different stuff that suits your needs, right? Or suits your identity, your family, your where you're from, that kind of stuff. While with monotheism, it becomes accept this and reject everything else. And so, which was obviously very catchy. It has a certain
helps for an imperial set of governance because you're like we have,
and it helps for missionaries because with missionaries you say we are right, you are wrong, so believe us or else. Right. On the other hand, with polytheism, it's like, yeah, believe this if you want. That's all it is. It's believe this if you want because we're not just denying any of these taxes. Other divinities. Yeah,
just pay your taxes.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, this has been a fun discussion, and obviously you have a lot of stuff going on. Can you tell us any future events or books coming out, articles, whatever you want to promote here?
Well, I have some articles coming out, but they're not for the general public per se. They're more scholarly stuff, but I'll definitely be talking about them like here. Like I mentioned that article on sacrifice I have coming out soon. But I've in the aftermath of becoming a mild celebrity, I suppose that's the wrong word, but becoming more well known. I'm trying to. I bought some new mics, which you helped contribute to like this one in front of me to level up on my YouTube.
Right.
And one of my big goals there, and I hope people do come and subscribe, is I want to give more of a voice to for sort of how do archaeologists really do things. Right. Like what kind of questions do we really ask? I think that I want to do a lot of fun things, which is why I have a video on ancient drugs, but I want to also get people to understand the methods and questions and what 21st century archaeology is my goal over the next few years on YouTube. And then in terms of books, I'm writing a book on Atlantis. I started writing it before I went on Joe Rogan. It's been something I've been working on, but slowed down because I had some illness issues. But I'm picking it up again, and I'm hoping to get that published in the next year or two. Probably it'll be more like a timeline of 2 to 3 because that's how publishing works. But and so I want to crank through that though while people are excited about this, and it's partly about the Greek idea of Atlantis and how we can understand it from the evidence of Plato, from the evidence of Greek mythology, some of what we even talked about today on the sort of continuity and ways of linking mythology to the archaeological record. And then some of it's about kind of more modern iterations on Atlantis, sort of this idea of this Ice Age civilization, and to show, we have more evidence for the Ice Age than people really think. It really is a hell of a lot of evidence. There's really no chance in hell that there's some sort of advanced global civilization. We have new stuff to discover about the Ice Age. I'm not going to deny that. And if I discover Atlantis, I promise I'll be the first one to tell everybody. But at the same time, the evidence is just so slim. It's just not there. And so non-existent even. So I want to what I realized is nobody's ever really explained clearly to the public why archaeologists are not looking for Atlantis. Why don't they take these ideas seriously? And so I want to explain what our evidence is that causes us to be so confident about that. And instead, the kinds of questions that we are focused on and how we do target and discover all the new stuff that everybody sees in the news or covered on YouTube or whatever, because obviously amazing archaeology is happening all the time. We're discovering new stuff with new methods everywhere and all over the world. And I think that it's important to share that and not just always dress it up with the same old headlines that we always see, you know? Yeah.
Can't wait to see that. That's going to be great. And thanks again for your time. And
Yeah.
you have attained true gnosis.
Thank you. You too.